We're joined by Jeff Weiner of the Orlando Sentinel talking about today's goings-on at the Zimmerman Trial down in Sanford, Florida. Jeff, how are you?
How are you? Thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's always my pleasure, sir. All right, let's talk about a lot of things. First of all, let's start with the medical examiner that was not actually the medical examiner that was responsible for the body of Trayvon Martin. I guess she was brought on just to say what she said, which was that in her opinion, George Zimmerman did not, actually his injuries were insignificant. And that one punch could have caused all the stuff to the face, and his head was probably hit maybe once, pounded once. Not, she didn't say pounded, but hit into the ground once. That's what she said. But to me, Mark O'Mara, I thought he did a great job on cross-examination.
Yes, she was kind of a surprise witness. We weren't really expecting her to testify. She's the local medical examiner for the prosecutors in this case, who are based out of Jacksonville and Duval, Clay, and Nassau counties up kind of to the north of us. Obviously, there's a special prosecutor in this case, Angela Corey. So Valerie Rao, the doctor who testified today, did not perform the autopsy and didn't really do any of the work in terms of the evidence gathering herself. She said that she was provided the evidence, that she reviewed it, provided by the prosecution, and that she came to the conclusion that Zimmerman's injuries were not life-threatening, that they were insignificant. On cross-examination, though, Mark O'Mara definitely got her to walk back a lot of what she said. She was initially saying that the injuries were consistent with just one blow or possibly a punch and then a hit into a contact with the concrete. But during the defense's questioning, she kind of said, well, it could also be consistent with two blows. And then Mark O'Mara basically took her through every single injury that he could identify on George Zimmerman. And for a lot of them, she said, yeah, it's possible that was a separate blow. By my count, she got up to, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9.
Yeah, it was incredible what he did to her. And then a lot of times she didn't understand. And I just think, again, here's another case of the prosecution bringing somebody up. And in the end, after the cross-examination, the defense either comes out ahead or at the very least negates what they said under examination by the prosecution. And it's a draw, which is reasonable doubt.
Yes, and I've been following along. I was very interested to see what local legal commentators around here would be saying about this, and they kind of said what you're saying, which is that the state did score some points. She mentions that she disputes Zimmerman's use of the term slam, says that implies great force, and she's not seeing that with these injuries. She noted that his cuts didn't require stitches, but there's also that thing where the defense gets up and they basically poke a bunch of holes into everything that she said, and she wound up conceding a lot of what she seemed to be saying initially, not to mention that Mark O'Mara brought up the fact that she was basically appointed, at least recommended for appointment by State Attorney Angela Corey, who's the special prosecutor in this case, suggesting that she had a reason to be a favorable witness.
Right, and that she wasn't reappointed to the head of department, wherever it was, in whichever jurisdiction. She said she didn't apply for it, and then O'Mara said because of irregularities or problems within the department, he said yes. She said yes. So, right away, okay, her department had some problems, so she wasn't reappointed, and now she's working for the prosecution, and she was very under cross-examination, I wouldn't say non-cooperative, but maybe didn't understand and didn't want to say what she was saying and didn't like being there. And I just think that O'Mara did a masterful job in tearing apart what she said. Let's move on to the earlier testimony in the day of the detective. Something very interesting happened, I guess, from yesterday, where yesterday the detective was asked if he felt that George Zimmerman was telling the truth, and he said he was either telling the truth or he was, you tell me, or he was a pathological liar.
Right. It was a very interesting exchange that came right at the very end of testimony yesterday, where basically Mark O'Mara was questioning the investigator about George Zimmerman's reaction when Zimmerman was told that there could be video of the fight. Obviously, that was a ploy by the investigator. He was just trying to get a reaction out of Zimmerman, and Zimmerman said, "Thank God." So Serino said basically, that reaction, he'd either have to be a pathological liar or be telling the truth. And O'Mara asked, "Do you think he's a pathological liar?" Serino said no. So therefore, they were left with Serino essentially acknowledging that he believes Zimmerman was telling the truth. Then, when the attorneys came to court today, the state had a motion ready asking for the judge to exclude that testimony. Basically, witnesses are not supposed to comment on each other's testimony. On each other's credibility or the credibility of the defendant. That's
right.
Something that's up to the jury to decide. So the judge wound up agreeing with the state on that one question about whether he believed Zimmerman was telling the truth, and the jury was told to disregard it. Obviously,
it's hard to disregard, right?
That.
Right. It's like, you know, when you ask a question and then withdraw it, but your point is made. Also, explain to me why the prosecution decided to show Sean Hannity's interview with George Zimmerman. Was there, and then if I'm not mistaken, there was nothing else said about it. It was like, to me, a Sopranos episode that left you hanging and was never addressed again in future weeks, which used to disappoint me a lot. What was the purpose of showing it?
Well, I think the purpose of the purpose of all of these statements that they're playing by George Zimmerman seems to be, and it's the reason why defense attorneys often tell their clients not to speak or not to speak often publicly when they're accused of a crime, is that the more statements you make, the more inconsistencies there are going to be between them. Whether that implies deception or it's just part of human nature, you know, remains up for debate on a case-by-case basis. They wanted to show yet another version of Zimmerman telling his story. They were hoping the jury would pick up inconsistencies there. He did kind of go into, there's a moment in that interview where he's talking about whether or not he followed Trayvon Martin or not. In openings, the defense acknowledged that he did follow Trayvon Martin, but during the interview he kind of says, no, I just was walking in the direction that he was walking in. It's kind of an equivocation, but I think that the state's certainly hoping that all of those minor things kind of add up to something. And of course, there's also the line that was much discussed when that interview came out last year, which was George Zimmerman saying that this was all part of God's plan. So it's possible they're playing on some emotions there as well.
And we're talking to Jeff Weiner of the Orlando Sentinel here on the Steve Malzberg Show about the Zimmerman trial down in Sanford. You know, to me, if you recall, the female police detective and possibly the male police detective or officer, I should say, were asked, do people's stories, you know, vary as they've told them once and as they've told them again? And they said, yes, it's natural. Did you notice any extreme variance in Zimmerman's stories to you? No. It was within the normal range. So, I mean, you know, if the prosecution is looking to say, oh, look, here he said he didn't really follow him, but he told police. What he told police was very consistent, I think, with hardly any slight variations. And again, with these wounds, you know, I think that O'Mara's going to be able to do an effective job, because there's been testimony to that effect, of saying, hey, imagine you're on the bottom. Did the screams sound like it were coming from a man who wasn't in fear of his life, who wasn't getting hurt? I mean, look at his nose. I mean, people aren't going to believe a medical examiner who says, oh, they're insignificant. You know, or I just think that this has been such a slam dunk for the defense so far. Let me ask you a question. Is there any talk whatsoever that if things keep going this way, the defense doesn't even put on a case, they just go to closing arguments?
You know, I don't think that that's what most people, you know, what most people in the legal community down here are expecting, just because the defense seemed to put a lot of preparation into preparing their case. They've been acting as though they're going to put on a case, and you know, part of the problem with that is, even if you feel that the state's case has been insufficient, if you promised anything to the jury in your opening that then they're not going to see because you didn't put on a state, there's always a case, and there's always that concern. But Mark O'Mara did say early on in the trial, you know, when he was asked if Zimmerman would testify, his response to that was, I haven't even decided if I'm going to put on a case yet. So at least in what he said publicly, he's left the door open for that to happen. And regardless of whether they put on a case before that happens, we're certainly going to see something called a motion for judgment of acquittal by the defense, which is very common. It happens in most trials, if not all.
And I would expect this judge to say, no, we have a minute left or less. What could we expect tomorrow? Are we going to see forensic experts? Are we going to see the autopsy, the medical examiner? Are we going to see Trayvon's mother?
I think we could see all of the above. We still haven't heard from about bullet forensics or DNA. Still haven't heard about Trayvon Martin's autopsy.
And of course, we did hear from the medical examiner that there were bruises or cuts or abrasions, as she called them, that are consistent with punching somebody on the knuckles of Trayvon Martin. And she did say no other wounds except the bullet wounds. So again, if he was getting hit by George Zimmerman, there was no evidence of it. Okay, hey, Jeff, hopefully we'll speak to you tomorrow.